if you are allowed to
just a moment,
contextualize, you would say some of the things that Muhammad did is crap. You would say some of the did.
In one of the most electrifying and revealing debates about the true nature of Islam and its relationship with peace, a Christian woman took the floor and did something unexpected. With sharp reasoning grounded in historical facts, sacred texts, and irrefutable logic, she completely dismantled the attempts of Muslim apologists to defend their perspective. From the very beginning, the debate was tense. The Muslim debaters were confident, believing they could counter any objection and reaffirm their position that Islam is, above all, a religion of peace. However, as the Christian woman presented her points, their confidence began to waver. Her approach was not one of personal attack, but of deep questioning, based on knowledge and careful interpretation of religious texts. She brought up passages that many avoid discussing, exposed historical events that contradict the commonly accepted narrative, and asked questions that simply could not be convincingly answered by the Muslim apologists. One by one, their arguments were deconstructed, and the audience watched in silence, absorbing every word spoken. The impact was immediate. Some members of the audience were visibly uncomfortable, while others seemed impressed by the clarity and courage of this woman. The debate panel itself began to fragment, with some trying to redirect the discussion and others admitting that they had no satisfactory answers to the challenges raised. What made this moment even more powerful was the serenity with which she spoke. There was no anger or hostility in her words, only the truth being exposed in a clear and firm manner. And this approach made all the difference, as instead of provoking an extreme defensive reaction, her words sparked reflection. Before watching the full video of this astonishing debate, there is a Bible verse that perfectly fits this discussion. "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." John 14:27. Now get ready to witness one of the most impactful moments of this debate, where truths were revealed, beliefs were challenged, and the audience was forced to see reality from a new perspective.
What we're talking about here is the failure to contextualize actions for the standards of their time. And I'll come back to the point I made, because Douglas, you didn't address it despite your protestations that you were going to. Now let me just ask you again. Martin Luther was a fundamentalist, wasn't he?
Absolutely.
All Christians will agree with you that he was a fundamentalist.
Can I now answer Majid's question?
Please.
And then I want to bring in Zeba.
If there were currently Lutheran, there are Lutherans around, you meet them occasionally in Scandinavia and so on, very nice, very nice it is, and peaceable guys they are by and large. If, however, there was a large proportion of Lutherans somewhere in Scandinavia that started blowing up non-Lutherans, or no, sorry, let's be absolutely right, started massacring peasants, do you think the people would say, hang on a minute, let's not criticize Martin Luther, he did that by the standards of his time, we shouldn't criticize his followers all that much, we shouldn't point out what he said and so on. No, we just say, you know, don't go and massacre peasants, full stop. It was rubbish at
Douglas,
the time, it's rubbish now. It's the same with the Quran.
You're missing the point. If you're failing to judge...
Now, let me bring in your opponent.
I just wanted to point out, in terms of when we're talking about the Quran and saying that we can't contextualize it, that's simply not true. That is a debate that's hot in the community amongst Muslim scholars and amongst Muslims themselves. We're debating that very question. Is the Quran a living document? Much like it's similar in comparison to, say, the Constitution and the debates that happen around that. Around that. The fact is, scholars say that, you know, when you look at the Quranic Arabic, there can be, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 interpretations for every word. There's only certain things in the Quran that scholars agree are concrete, like the concept of God, afterlife, things like that. But beyond that, there is a wide range of interpretation, which is why there is a history that not many people look at, and that's part of the problem, that nobody's actually looked at the history of debate within Islam about every sort of aspect that can come to mind.
Let's be real here. Every time we try to contextualize past actions based on the standards of the time, we end up falling into a trap. That's because certain actions, no matter how normal they were back then, remain wrong, yesterday, today, and always. And that's exactly what this discussion brings to light. Let's start with Martin Luther. The speaker claims he was a fundamentalist and that all Christians would agree with that. But, hold on, is it really that simple? Luther wanted to reform the church, not create a rigid and closed system. He challenged dogmas, wanted people to read the Bible for themselves. But fundamentalist in the modern sense of the word, maybe not. What we need to understand is that he lived in a completely different time, and his ideas clashed with the status quo of that era. Now, the comparison with Muslims today. The argument goes something like this. If there were a large group of Lutherans today massacring peasants, would we relativize Luther's words, or would we outright condemn the acts? And here's the issue. You can take any text, religious or not, and twist its interpretation to justify anything. The speaker himself admits that there are different interpretations of the Quran, which already dismantles the idea that all Muslims follow a single path. And here's an important insight. It doesn't matter if something was culturally accepted at the time. If it was morally wrong, it remains wrong. And this applies to any religion, philosophy, or ideology. At the same time, we need to understand historical contexts and not judge the past as if it were the present. This doesn't mean making excuses, but rather analyzing the facts with a more balanced perspective. Another interesting point, the Quran is a living document, much like a constitution. Just as laws are interpreted in different ways over time, religious texts are too. So saying that Islam has a single, fixed interpretation is a mistake. The real problem begins when radical groups take these texts and distort them to the extreme to justify atrocities. But that doesn't mean all Muslims think the same way. At the end of the day, what we really need is to stop this habit of generalizing everything. Not every Christian is the same, not every Muslim is the same, and not every text should be interpreted in a rigid way. And most importantly, condemn what is wrong, regardless of the time period, without falling into the trap of ignoring historical contexts.
I disagree with that. The reason why I disagree with it, it would be more accurate, Ziba, if you said the scholars that you find attractive say that. But there are a bunch of scholars with a great number of following in Islam, all of them are self-appointed, by the way, because there's no hierarchy, there's no seminary of Islam, except a University of Al-Azhar, and we know the products of Al-Azhar. But there are scholars like Bin Laden who say we have to take
He's not a scholar by anyone's
he
measure.
has the greatest following. He has
That's
the
not
greatest
true.
following. The Islamic Brotherhood, Hassan
not true.
al-Banna, when you look at the Sunni Islam, when you look at Ayatollah Khomeini in the 20th century, the most influential guy of Shia Islam, another self-appointed scholar, you have all of it. Sheikh bin Baz, he has the greatest following. Sheikh al-Qaradawi, maybe these are individuals that are not attractive to you, but then it would be more accurate if you stated that. They are attractive to many Muslims, not thousands, but in the millions. And what they say, and that's why they're influential, is they challenge every single Muslim individual. Are you a true Muslim? If you are a true Muslim, you live by what the Quran dictates, you follow the example of the Prophet Muhammad.
Their interpretation,
and those
though.
scholars who insist on that are far more influential, far more powerful than your
Ayan, you just
soft-spoken,
quoted-
wonderful, cuddly scholars.
Well,
Imagine Noah.
so Ayan, you just quoted Bin Laden as a scholar and Hassan al-Banna as a scholar. Bin Laden, for those of you who don't know, is an engineer, a qualified engineer. So don't know him.
Why don't you define who is a scholar?
Don't know his history. He's a qualified engineer who comes from one of the richest construction families in Saudi Arabia and was educated in the elite private schools of Switzerland and Saudi Arabia. Hassan al-Banna that you referred to was a school teacher. And in fact, what you find common with all of the movements that you're worried about and that I'm worried about and we're all worried about are that they are founded by people who do not have a theological background. Now, for all we think of Al-Azhar and their very conservative views, what we don't find is that Al-Azhar produces the likes of Bin Laden and Hassan al-Banna, or even Maududi, the founder of the Jamaat Islami in the Indian subcontinent. Maulidi was a journalist.
Sayyid
Qutb, the founder of modern-day jihadism, was a literary critic who came to America on a scholarship in the 1950s to study literature. He was not a theologian. So coming back to the point,
Why don't
please,
you name
Ayan,
a number
don't
of scholars
define
who are
for
influential
the
who are
whole
not?
world.
This statement raises a crucial point about authority and legitimacy in the Islamic world. After all, who can be considered a true scholar or academic in Islam? The key issue here is that unlike Christianity, which has well-established seminaries and hierarchies, Islam does not follow a single model of theological education. The central argument in this discussion is that figures like Bin Laden and Hassan al-Banna were not scholars in the traditional sense, but rather leaders who used their own interpretations to influence millions. And this is an interesting point. People without formal theological training can indeed gain a massive following and shape the religious views of thousands. But does that make them legitimate authorities? What becomes clear is that influence does not necessarily equate to academic credibility. Many of the figures mentioned were not theologians, but journalists, literary critics, engineers. This raises an important reflection. To what extent should we consider individuals with a large following as legitimate interpreters of a faith? This is a question that remains open and continues to be debated worldwide.
Because actually the people you refer to were not qualified theologians.
But don't you touch on the problem by admitting this? Don't you touch on the problem that is inherent in Islam after the death of Muhammad? That the problem of who speaks for Islam has not been resolved. It could be the two of you,
what's
it
that
could
got
be
to do with
Bin
Islam
Laden,
being a
it
religion of
could be
peace?
Al-Qaradawi, it could be Faisal Shahzad, it could be
Faisal
me.
Shahzad is
I
an
wanna go
engineer.
directly-
Sorry, nothing against engineers in the
question
crowd.
he just
Please
asked,
vote for
what
us,
does
but
that have to
seriously.
do with Islam being a religion of peace? If you're almost making the argument that Islam is what you want it to be, depending on how you behave. So if you behave peacefully, is it not a religion of peace to you?
That is a brilliant question. When you can start by saying Islam is a different thing to 1.57 billion people. And from that general point, you can reduce it to what is it that unifies them. And ultimately, you will get to the Quran and the Hadith. The Quran, the Hadith, the Day of Judgment. The belief in the Day of Judgment. And if you take those three concepts, then it's far from a religion of peace. Because you look, first of all, not only at the content of the Quran, in context, fine, I'm willing to contextualize it, but what if other believers are not and they're influential? What if I want to read Muhammad's practices simply as a matter of history, another great figure in history, but more Muslims, millions of Muslims don't want to do that
Right,
and
so-
really
so
want to follow
if
his
you're willing
practice.
that you are
What
able to-
if more and more Muslims invest in the hereafter more than they invest in life? Then we have a problem. And that's why I ask you to vote against the motion. It cannot be only a religion of peace. Because if it were
Douglas-
only a religion of peace, if it were perfect, why would we have this debate?
Douglas,
Why would we
given the
be
long
talking about
run that
reforming
Ayan
it?
had, can you be
Why would we even be talking about reforming this religion? The real question is not just whether Islam can be considered a religion of peace, but rather who has the right to define what Islam truly is. Unlike Christianity, which is firmly rooted in the teachings of Jesus, Islam has been a battleground for authority disputes since the death of Muhammad. And this lack of an uncontested central figure has created a persistent issue, the absence of a single, definitive interpretation. Throughout history, different groups and religious leaders have appropriated Islamic doctrine to shape it according to their own interests and views. Since there is no pope in Islam, no supreme authority to determine, in absolute terms, what is right and what is wrong, each sect interprets the sacred texts in its own way. And this has profound consequences. One scholar may argue that Islam preaches peace and harmony among nations, while another may claim that jihad, interpreted as holy war, is the true essence of the faith. Both rely on the same texts, but reach completely different conclusions. And why does this matter? Because truth should not be subjective. something that changes depending on time, place, or political interests. In Christianity, there is undeniable clarity. When Jesus declared, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," John 14:6, he established an absolute principle. Teachings on loving one's neighbor, forgiveness, and compassion have been consistently interpreted over the centuries. When he instructed to turn the other cheek, the message of pacifism was unmistakable. There is no room for an alternative interpretation that claims he actually meant the opposite. But in Islam, the absence of a central authority creates theological instability. With each era, each region, and under each new ruler, interpretations can shift drastically. What one group considers essential, another may deem irrelevant or even heretical. This raises a fundamental question. How can one trust a doctrine whose rules and meanings seem to depend on who is in power? How can one follow a faith that throughout the centuries appears to have been shaped more by men than by an unchanging principle?